Welcome back, everyone, to this series of videos introducing you to ethical theory. Okay, so in these two videos, we want to start to learn about deontology or deontological ethics. Don't be thrown off. Deon is just the Greek word for obligation or duty, so all we're really looking at here is the study of our duties. As we'll see, mostly in our second video on deontology, that's going to be Immanuel Kant's preferred way of referring to the obligations we all have: duties. Christine Korsgaard, you've seen in the assigned chapter, prefers to discuss our reciprocal responsibilities, which she also says captures Kant's meaning, though I think we'll notice some differences in this first video. And in yet a third way of talking about obligations, this is the language of Thomas Scanlon, who's in a couple of supplementary readings on Canvas. Deontological views result in a set of rules that specify what we owe to each other. So, key concepts emerging here: duties, responsibilities, rules, what we owe to each other. And we might also add rights, which can be of real significance to a deontological theory, but when they are, it's because rights flow from duties. I want to tell you, there are rights theories that have nothing to do with duties or maybe even morality at all, but that's a topic we can cover together later. Then, one more key concept. We have to keep in mind universalism. The duties these thinkers are talking about aren't limited or practical duties of the sort that you owe as part of a particular institution, given some role you play, for instance. Take, for example, if you're a lawyer working within legal institutions, there are certain rules you have to follow. The same is true if you're a doctor or an accountant or whatever. And even students of Princeton University play the role of student in this institution, and they're bound by a document called, wait for it, Rights, Rules, and Responsibilities. And yet, these are particular duties or rules that bind you only because you are a member of this institution. They are not universal duties of the sort that deontologists have in mind. Nor are the deontologists talking about duties to a particular country, like duties we owe because we're citizens of this or that place. And they're not talking about duties we owe to family, church, or community, duties we owe because of our particular associations with others. No, deontological theories are always talking about something bigger: the duties we have as human beings, as rational beings, things we owe to all others as such. Of course, there could be a couple different iterations of rational and what obligations flow from that. Consider two differing ideas here. Kant says that even to be rational beings ourselves, we have to be willing to abide by moral principles that would respect all others as rational beings, and which they could accept as rational beings for reasons we're going to see. In Scanlon's view, it's a little bit different. This view is known as contractualism. For him, you have to be willing to act according to principles that would be the same for all, because that respects all the others as contracting parties to the moral world that we all live in. And Scanlon says that we have to propose principles to others that no one could reasonably reject. Those slight differences there in definitions of rationality, but you see the core concept emerging. One other: for the deontologists, these moral principles are universal and egalitarian. I don't propose that you should be peaceful while I kill. That would be an assertion of my power. That would give me carte blanche to dominate you and others. To be equal, we all must be bound by the same obligations as and to each other. But this deontological form of universalism leads to two criticisms. The first set of criticisms surround the way that duty-based thinking considers or fails to consider the consequences of our actions. One such thing the critics say is that it is too rigorous, demanding that we follow rules no matter what the consequences might be. The critics say this is absurd. Under a deontological ethic, they say, you wouldn't be able to break the rule "do not steal," even if stealing a piece of candy from a store could save a life. Say, for instance, there were a person in diabetic shock who could be saved with just a little dose of sugar. Some wavering deontologists might say that you could deal with consequences in a way that's a bit more flexible. But the critics say that if you do that, then deontology will be essentially empty, providing us with no real principles to follow at all. So say you altered the rule, do not steal, to be do not steal unless you can do some good by stealing. Then there'd really be no guidance as to what that good is. The critics say you'd need some form of consequentialism to back up this new contextual rule. For instance, utilitarianism could be used to tell you which consequences would be better than others, which would be worth it, for which you could steal, so on. But the deontologists respond, and we're going to see this especially in our second video, that these criticisms simply misunderstand duty-based thinking. Of course you have to take consequences seriously, but they don't think that you should judge each act by its consequences. Instead, you think about what the predictable consequences of your action would be if everybody did the same. Again, the goal is a universal argument. Since morality means that I propose principles that you would find it acceptable to live by as well, or at least wouldn't reject in Scanlon's terminology, then I have to think about the consequences of universalizing the behavior that I propose to engage in. And almost all the deontologists agree that you can't do this if your proposed principles would trap you in a contradiction. The predictable consequences of everyone following the rule, do not steal unless you can do some good, would be to undermine the very concept of ownership, which was the basis of the do not steal norm to begin with. So you wouldn't be able to will do not steal as a norm or rule, and also, at the same time, will the predictable consequences of ownership rules being widely disregarded. That would amount to saying everyone's going to decide for themselves when to take, and what reasons to take for. There will be no ownership anymore. You'd have willed the do not steal rule simply out of existence. In our second video on deontology, we're going to consider Kant's example of the rule against lying, which is his most talked about application of an unbreakable rule. He says, you cannot lie, even if there's a murderer at your door who's going to murder your best friend and forces you to answer a question about the whereabouts of that friend who's upstairs in the house, you know. We'll see that he says you can't will the principle tell the truth and lie in these or any circumstances without willing a contradiction. You would simply will truth out of existence. But we will get back to that. For now, I want to delve into a criticism that's a bit more abstract, but the deontologists say this point is vital to defend against because it goes straight to the heart of the practical nature of their theory. The critics say that deontology relies on an unrealistic picture of the human moral self. They say that the duty-based thinkers suppose some sort of divided self, according to which there's one you that wants to steal the thing, and another you who lives in this abstract universal realm inhabited by all other people, reasoning about what everyone would do if they followed the same principles. That is the self that reasons about the universal. The second you, for simplicity's sake, we'll call it the obligated self, would then control the first you and make you not steal. Okay, now when the critics state this argument in this way, they're trying to make deontology sound a bit silly. They want to imply that it's somehow strange, that it's based on some airy metaphysical assumptions of some sort. But Korsgaard responds that this is the most practical assumption in the world. It actually permeates everything you do. You, she says, would simply be unable to operate in this world, this real practical world, if you didn't assume that the others you interact with are rule-governed creatures themselves, that they have these two selves, as it were. For instance, you put in an order for some food at a fast food place. You simply assume, right, that for the purposes of this interaction, the person on the other end of that order is capable of setting aside their own desires right now and acting in a truly rule-governed manner. They will not, for instance, just steal your money and run. They barely even need to think about consequences, about the law, or if they'll lose their job, because most people, it turns out, just simply won't steal. And they'll also take care that the food they make be edible for anyone who would eat it. They will take care in general. So, in other words, they will, in a bunch of ways, treat you according to principles that anyone could follow. They do unto you as they would be done unto. And Korsgaard suggests that our ordinary social interaction fully relies on us making the very sort of supposedly weird, airy assumptions that deontology's critics scoff at. But if she's right, then it's the critics' views that are actually unrealistic and even disrespectful. If you think, for instance, that it's power that makes the fast food worker follow the rules, or it's mere conformity to social norms, you'd be deeply disrespecting this person's capacity to act on their own. They're not an automaton whose limbs are forced to move by causes. They act according to that other self, the obligated self. Perhaps you think social conditions should be different. And of course, the deontologist could be with you as you critique inequalities and so forth. But the way to do that, they would say, isn't to disrespect the capacity for free action of others. In that piece you read by Korsgaard, she does a great job explaining the differences between what Kant calls the phenomenal and the noumenal selves. Don't be thrown off by the terminology, it's what I just explained to you. Kant is simply saying that the one self exists in the realm of causes, the phenomena of this world, so it's the phenomenal self, and the other self simply isn't confined to being caused. It is itself the originating source of causes. The third section of Korsgaard's paper, starting on about page 200, is about Kant's two standpoints. Honora O'Neill discusses the standpoints as well and makes this point on page 181. For Kant, one standpoint we have is in the world of nature, in which we know that we are buffeted about by various different causes, though we also cause things to happen. But our very ability to contemplate that world, O'Neill says, can show us that we also exist in a realm of freedom, in which we are uncaused and we are the originating cause of our own moral actions. And here's something cool. Korsgaard makes the surprising argument that the phenomenal self is the merely theoretical self, while the noumenal one is the practical one. Now, you might think that you're free when you take actions with your money, or you make the decision to walk to your eating club for food or something like that. But she argues that's a merely theoretical freedom. Because you know some wiseacre who's taken Intro to Philosophy can always come along and say to you, your actions are simply determined by things that have come before. You have no free will. You're acting on material desires that move you. You're acting on an upbringing that caused you to value money and a bunch of prior actions that brought eating clubs into existence even in the first place and put value on them, gave them prestige, made you even want to be part of one. And if you've ever listened to somebody having a debate about free will versus determinism and you wanted to say, oh my God, I am out of here, this is purely theoretical, well, Korsgaard agrees with you. But where you might resolve the debate by going back to your actions and eating your meal and spending your money, she would resolve the debate by saying something like, that seems to me to be an illusory freedom, because you're never going to know whether your actions actually were determined. But you can know your actions are free if you do what you are responsible for, your duty in Kant's terms. But we know that Korsgaard's terminology is a bit different, responsibilities. She argues on 197 to 198 that some people think that responsibility is a fact about a person, a fact that they caused a particular action, and so they have to be held responsible for it. But that, she says, is merely theoretical. The question in court wouldn't be whether my shooting a gun really 100% caused a death. Maybe the person was sickly anyway. Maybe they scare easily and the mere sound of the gun gave them a heart attack. Maybe the ambulance was late and they would have lived otherwise. No, Korsgaard says, responsibility isn't about those causal things, it's moral. you hold me responsible because I didn't respect a proper relationship with the victim. That is far more practical than saying that we're looking for a surefire way to prove that my actions were the sole cause of the death. Okay, I'm going to close this video with an example she uses from page 199. Let's say you knew a friend in a very unhealthy relationship, always being deeply hurt by their partner's emotional mistreatment. The partner had a difficult upbringing, was perhaps the victim of emotional mistreatment themselves. It would be understandable to think that familial or sociological forces caused the mistreatment in some sense. You wouldn't be wrong to urge your friend to leave the relationship if that was necessary for her own health. The partner's behavior was caused. Some might excuse them, but practically speaking, your friend doesn't have to. Their partner is responsible for their own behavior. We are all responsible for healthy relationships of reciprocity. That their poor behavior was caused cannot mean they are not responsible, especially to your friend, to anyone else they would have an intimate relationship with. So I'm going to leave you there with Course Guard's deontology. We're going to come back in our second video and talk about Kant's example on lying.